Hello and welcome to my podcast, The History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran here with episode 67, season 2, The Rise of Achyuta Raya of Vijayanagara. I left you in the year 1529. Krishnadeva had passed and so did the throne. His successor was his brother Achyuta. The following someone like Krishnadeva Raya was no easy matter, and to this day history does not have a reasonable measure of Achyuta. But who could be envious of his situation? He had a hard act to follow. There was not a corner of the land that was not fraught with danger. Vijayanagara's enemies waiting at the gate, the Portuguese friendship cooling off, and within the palace was Aliya Rama Raya, friend or foe. And that today is my story, which I will get to as soon as I get a moment to thank the Prestige Group for their sponsorship of this podcast. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. When Krishnadeva died in 1529, the empire fell into a strange, heavy quiet, the kind that follows a storm. For 20 years, he had been the pulse of Vijayanagara, decisive, commanding, larger than life. Under him, the capital had gleamed like no other in India. And then almost overnight, that brilliance dimmed. The king's last years had been filled with sorrow. A long-awaited heir had been born, a baby boy, whose arrival set off months of celebration. But even before the festivities ended, the child fell ill and died. The complete story is in my previous episode, but in brief, believing his boy had been poisoned by Thimmarasu, his mentor and most trusted aide, he accused Thimmarasu and his sons, imprisoned them, and when his anger did not even abate after 3 years, Krishnadeva Raya had them blinded. When he changed his mind and concluded that Thimmarasu was innocent, the "what have I done" moment caused him mortal anguish. He became a shadow of himself, and when sickness came for him, he met it with a kind of weary silence, as though his will could no longer keep the world together. Even as he was dying, Krishnadeva Raya pondered his succession. His only surviving child was still a toddler, barely walking, and the empire could not wait for him to grow. One choice before him was his son-in-law, young, ambitious, intelligent, and while there was some talk of Krishnadeva thinking about this, he eventually decided that the only man fit for the throne was his younger half-brother, Achyuta, who, by some accounts, had been the co-regent when Krishnadeva had abdicated the throne in favor of his infant son, the one who had died. Some accounts say that Achyuta had spent some years in Chandragiri, quietly sidelined. Some say even under house arrest, just to keep him out of politics. Others say that he commanded troops in the brothers' war and served them very well. Well, whatever the facts, when his brother had died and he was now king, he left Chandragiri at once and rode into the capital. And until he arrived, the minister Saluva Veera Narasimha kept the flag flying. Achyuta's nomination to the crown was not uncontested. Some chroniclers suggest that on his deathbed, Krishnadeva named Achyuta because he was the only male of the line that could hold the empire together. Some hint that the choice was forced by the ministers who feared civil war more than they doubted Achyuta himself. Up to this point, though, Achyuta had served the empire faithfully for years. He had commanded the military and provincial campaigns. He was also learned, pious, and steady, but no one mistook him for his brother. Where Krishnadeva had been decisive and visible, Achyuta was thoughtful, inward, and cautious. Now these are qualities that would comfort priests but worry generals. It also worried Fernão Nuniz, whose contemporary chronicles shape much of what we know about this period and about Achyuta and about Vijayanagara in general. Probably mistaking Achyuta's caution for indecision, he labelled him feeble. Nuniz didn't think much of Achyuta, as we will see presently. He was consecrated in a series of ceremonies, 3 times consecrated, first at Tirupati for the initial consecration, then to Kalahasti, and finally the grand coronation at the capital, Vijayanagara. His queen, Varadambika, was right there beside him, consecrated as queen regent, and their son Venkatadri was installed as crown prince. By the general pomp and the hubbub of rituals, it might have felt for a moment as though the empire had found its rhythm again. But confidence, once broken, does not return just on command or on a wish list. So as soon as Achyuta became king, he was plunged into chaos. and it seemed that he faced challenges on every front. Now, how Achyuta dealt with all this is subject to interpretations, and historians have judged him variously, some of them favorably. But Nuniz, the only contemporary account, did not judge him well at all and was exceptionally harsh in his criticism. He called Achyuta a degenerate successor, feeble, selfish, and cruel. He said that the new king alienated his best friends by his despotism and proved himself to be a coward. Now, there have been several explanations for Nuniz's comments. They are speculative and ultimately besides the point, but they do bear some mentioning. At the bottom of it, it is possible that Nuniz failed in his trade as a horse salesman, and his offers rejected by Vijayanagara or frustrated by them at any rate, and he directed all his bitterness at Achyuta. The odds in any case were stacked against any favorable judgment of the man, because Krishnadeva was preeminent as a warrior, statesman, administrator, patron of the arts, often called the greatest South Indian monarch. His period represented the peak of Vijayanagara glory, and all this established an extremely high and rather unfair bar against which Achyuta would be measured. Besides all of this, there was suspicion in the court. Many of the men who had served Krishnadeva were still alive. Rumors resurfaced about the dead prince, the blinding of Timmarasu, and the possibility that Achyuta had benefited from all this tragedy. None of it was proven, of course, but belief needs no proof when power is in question. Later events would show that Achyuta was no slouch and ready to prove that he was up to the task, even if he would never be his brother. And there was plenty of opportunity to prove himself. To begin with, things between Vijayanagara and the Portuguese had started cooling after Krishnadeva Raya passed. Achyuta seemed a little more circumspect about allowing Portuguese control of the western seaboard and less inclined to allow their consequent monopoly over the supply of war horses. Now, their monopoly on horses and coastal trade challenged, and resentment crept into every report that the Portuguese sent home about Achyuta. Because trade was the cornerstone of everything that happened in the Deccan, it's worth looking at the relationship between Vijayanagara and Portuguese in some detail in the wake of Krishnadeva's death. But I will return to this presently. Right now, Achyuta had troubles from the neighbors, and he had to deal with them on priority. Enemies like Bijapur and the Gajapatis represented vastly more danger than the Portuguese, who could be handled through diplomacy. The Indian kingdoms of the Adil Shahis and the Gajapatis represented an existential threat, and Achyuta needed to rise to the challenge and defend his kingdom. Now, if we turn from the Portuguese letters that wrote badly about Achyuta to Vijayanagara inscriptions, a completely different Achyuta appears. Now, this was one in control and who represented stability and not decay. By 1530, threats had already started to gather on the northeastern frontier. The Gajapati, Prataparudra of Orissa and Kuli Qutub Shah of Golconda tested Vijayanagara's resolve, hoping to recover lands that Krishnadeva had taken from them. Achyuta's response was swift. He marched north and defeated their armies. Now the empire's edges held firm, but even so, danger presented itself from the northwest. Ismail Adil Shah of Bijapur crossed the Krishna, and he besieged the Raichur Doab, where Krishnadeva had once triumphed. For 3 months, Adil Shah's cannons pounded the Raichur walls. Finally, Raichur and Mudgal fell, and Vijayanagara lost more than forts. It lost the memory of its invincibility. Still, the empire stood, the treasury was full, the army reorganized, the officials unshaken. The wound was pride, it was not survival. And then the greater test came from within the kingdom. In the Chola country, a governor named Selapa Dandanayaka, who was a Saluva by descent and one of Achyuta's trusted officers, raised rebellion. He gathered other discontented chiefs and declared independence. Achyuta did not hide behind ministers, as is said of him. He took the army and marched south himself, with his brother-in-law, Chinna Tirumaladeva, commanding the army. The campaign was brief and decisive. Selapa was defeated and order was restored. And then at Madurai, Achyuta reinstated the Pandyan ruler Chandrasekhara Pandya, who had been driven out in all this unrest. In gratitude, the Pandyan king offered his daughter in marriage to Achyuta, and now the empire gained both loyalty and alliance, and Achyuta gained a title, the restorer of the Pandyas. It was an old imperial ritual to conquer by restoring, and this worked just as well as any war of expansion or plunder. And now, Achyuta could focus on the Portuguese. This is the time I take a commercial break, and when I return, let's look at how Achyuta Raya handled the Portuguese. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back. The reason I want to focus on the Portuguese in India is because they represented the colonization of India. It was following their example that the French, the Dutch, and the British arrived, and like the Portuguese did, first to trade and then to rule, and basically to loot and plunder. The Portuguese in India were never content to trade like everyone else. They came with cannons and clerics and royal decrees, and they made the Arabian Sea their personal empire. From the moment that they took Goa from Adil Shah of Bijapur in 1509, they behaved as if the sea belonged to them. Their king Manuel even styled himself Lord of the Conquest, Navigation and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia and India. That wasn't a flourish or a boast, it was policy. They believed that everything that moved across those waters, from a bag of pepper to a horse, was theirs to control. And in all this, nothing mattered to them more than the horse trade. In the armies of the Deccan, the side that had the best horses usually won the battle. Local Indian horses were small and quick, no match for the great desert stallions from Arabia and Persia, tall, powerful, bred for endurance. Albuquerque, the Portuguese admiral, had written once to his king, "Whoever has the horses from Arabia and Persia will win." So he made sure that every horse from the Gulf passed through Portuguese hands. To do this, they first seized Hormuz, the key port at the mouth of the Arabian Gulf near Dubai, and forced every ship that carried horses to pay their customs. And by the 1530s, their monopoly was so complete that no horse could legally land on the west coast of India unless it had been licensed at Goa. In later years, even after Achyuta Raya, this arrangement was written into a treaty. Horses from Arabia and Persia could be bought by the kings of Vijayanagara, but none could be sold to Bijapur or any of its territories. In other words, the Portuguese had turned cavalry, which was the instrument of Indian power, into a commodity which only they could supply. And because every king needed horses, they could make their own terms. The Portuguese were military if anything, and they built forts wherever their trade needed protection. And these were standing reminders that commerce and conquest had become the same thing. Right along the coast, they raised forts, bastions at Diu, Chaul and Cochin, all linked to their capital at Goa. Their ships patrolled the seas like tax collectors with sails. The idea was simple: stop or divert as much of Sultanate trade as possible from the Red Sea and the Gulf, forcing it instead to go around the Cape of Good Hope where it could be taxed by the Portuguese crown. But monopolies, especially ones built on arrogance, always create resistance. Across the Arabian Sea, Asian merchants now were looking for new routes that lay outside Portuguese control, places like Perak and Trang in Southeast Asia, where the local rulers welcomed Muslim and Gujarati traders who had refused to buy Portuguese protection. On India's own coast, the Mapila Muslims of Malabar kept up a thriving counter-network. They had small, fast ships, and they slipped in and out of ports quickly and beyond Portuguese reach. And then there were the ports of Calicut and Cananore, and they continued to rival the so-called royal ports of Cochin and Goa. And the Portuguese captains complained endlessly that these Mapila fleets were a constant menace to their shipping lines and to their authority. Even inland, the powers that controlled the Deccan, Vijayanagara, Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Golconda, they were all still competing to buy horses from anyone who could get them past Portuguese patrols. Smuggling, in fact. And the feudatories along the coast, from Calicut to the Queen of Batkal, fought the Portuguese wherever their arrogance had crossed the line. And the result was an uneasy coexistence, open hostility on the water. But on the land, there was cautious diplomacy. Now, I just mentioned the Rani of Batkal, and I must pause here to speak a little bit about her. In the years when the Portuguese were spreading across India's western coast, there was this one small port that defied them again and again. This was Batkal. It was a narrow harbour, tucked between the sea and the beginnings of the forest slopes of the Western Ghats. Now, this was not ruled by a viceroy of the Portuguese or a general of Vijayanagara, but by a local woman. The Portuguese called her the Rania, the Batikala, or the Queen of Batkal. And in local memory, she is simply remembered as the Rani. Now, Batkal lay within the dominion of Vijayanagara and served as one of its outlets to the Arabian Sea. The rulers of Batkal had paid tribute to the Vijayanagara Empire, but they did manage their own fleets. When Krishnadeva and later Achyuta Raya governed from Vijayanagara, the Rani had maintained the coast, a watchful feudatory, guarding the trade routes that fed into the Deccan's wealth. But when the Portuguese took Goa in 1510 and began forcing their monopolies on every harbour they could reach, she became one of the first to resist. Her small navy, maybe just about 20 or 30 fast craft, they were designed for ambush. They were not interested in major battles. The ships the Portuguese called the galizabra, light, shallow-drafted boats, could dart in and out of the rocky inlets that lined the Konkan. She kept them hidden behind the sand spits until the enemy's heavier ships had committed themselves to a spot, and then she struck from both sides at once. For all their bravado and bluster, the letters that the Portuguese captains from Goa wrote to Lisbon were rather whiny. Like this: "The Queen of Batikala attacks our ships without fear and takes their goods." More than one Portuguese captain spoke about how he was forced to buy back his own men after she ransomed them for silver and horses. The Rani's defense of the harbour was as inventive as it was fierce. She lined the estuary with wooden palisades, planted stakes under the water to rip the hulls of the ships that had tried to enter. And when the wind was right, she sent fire rafts. Now, these were logs soaked with oil and set on fire, and they drifted towards the anchored vessels. From the cliffs above, her archers and matchlock men poured fire into the trapped flotilla. One report from 1530 tells of a Portuguese flagship grounding on a sand bank and being burnt by the people of the Queen. To the empire at Vijayanagara, she was a useful buffer, loyal in name, independent in practice. Her defiance kept the Portuguese at bay without drawing Vijayanagara directly into war. Now, Achyuta, occupied with threats on the northern frontier, left her to defend the port as she saw fit. Inscriptions from the region mentioned Batkal's temples and endowments that continued through the period. That was a sign that the port's civic life survived through all of these troubles. The Portuguese, for their part, could not understand how a woman, and one commanding native craft that too, could defy their super artillery. In his Book of Duarte Barbosa, a contemporary account, Barbosa notes, "The port of Batikala is ruled by a lady of great courage who maintains ships and defends her waters." Later Portuguese letters contain some rather grudging admiration. She was called valiant and subtle in war. She was called a pagan queen who would not yield. Now, Benjamin Lewis Rice, summarizing these accounts in the Gazetteer of Mysore, described her as a chieftainess of rare resolution who successfully resisted the attacks of the Portuguese fleet. Her resistance did not last forever. By the late 1530s, the Portuguese had strengthened their hold on the Konkan, and they turned their attention south. Batkal's trade declined, eclipsed by all the larger ports that the Portuguese controlled. Yet, the Rani's defense became legend, and mariners across the coast continued to warn each other, avoid the lady's waters. And in local ballads, her name endured as the protector of the harbour and the guardian of her people. The Rani's story stands at the intersection of empire and autonomy, and it's a reminder that the frontiers of Vijayanagara were not lines on a map, but living communities with living people, sometimes led by extraordinary individuals like her. The Rani of Batkal was certainly one of them, a feudatory who fought on her own terms, a woman who met cannon with courage, and a symbol of the quiet defiance that kept the empire's coastal world from falling entirely into foreign hands. For Achyuta, whose reign was marked by diplomacy more than conquest, Her courage served a purpose. She was both shield and symbol. She was proof that the empire's frontier was defended not only by its kings, but by those who refused to bend to the arrogance of the enemies. The definition of arrogance was justified because the methods of the Portuguese were brutal, to say the least. They acted less and less like merchants and more like crusaders with trading licenses. They carried a conviction that they had the right, divine right, to plunder and punish. Take Vasco da Gama. On his second voyage, he burnt a pilgrim ship containing hundreds of people and slaughtered 800 fishermen on the Malabar coast simply to make an example. Later Portuguese governors followed that example. Contemporary records describe their history as a series of atrocities. They raided and burnt coastal temples, and at one point, they even discussed plundering the great temple of Tirumalai, the same Tirupati that had crowned all the Vijayanagara kings. They seized the mainland territories of Salsetta, Ponda and Bardes, carving them more and more out of Bijapur's disarray while still claiming to be friendly with Vijayanagara. This treachery became the tool of their policy, and this treachery was the tool of colonialism in the years to come. They cultivated intrigues with Deccan nobles, most notoriously one with Asad Khan of Bijapur, promising him support in return for influence. And in 1537, the Sultan of Gujarat, Bahadur Shah, was killed while visiting a Portuguese governor aboard a ship while under truce. That act of betrayal confirmed their reputation across Asia. The Portuguese were brave, well-armed, and utterly untrustworthy. In such a climate, it's no surprise that their reports from India dripped with resentment. Take Nuniz. He wrote not only for the crown, but for an audience that expected moral vindication. Now, Nuniz himself wasn't a historian at all. He was a horse dealer. He spent 3 years in Vijayanagara trying and failing to make his fortune. His chronicle of Achyuta reads like the confession of a disappointed man venting frustration. It was during his time that the Portuguese monopoly was being quietly challenged. Their easy profits were slipping through other ports, including on the eastern seaboard, and their political standing with empires became less and less certain than before. Now the Portuguese were unwilling to risk a war with Vijayanagara, and they were unwilling to dictate the terms that they once had. But they found comfort in the story that Vijayanagara was weakening, and they felt it was easier to believe that the world was falling apart rather than to admit that their own power had limits. What Fernão Nuniz could not see or would not admit was that Achyuta's diplomacy was keeping the Deccan balanced at a time when every coast was aflame with all sorts of things, including ambition. The Portuguese wanted monopoly. The sultans wanted access. Vijayanagara wanted autonomy. In that angle, Achyuta managed what few rulers did. He achieved peace through equilibrium. And while the Portuguese wrote of decline, the Vijayanagara Empire's inscription spoke of continuity. And while the Portuguese complained of a feeble king, their own ledgers overflowed with ducats from Achyuta's markets. The reality was simple. The Portuguese had governed the sea, but Achyuta still ruled the land. This way, the Portuguese had missed the quieter story. They came looking for spectacle. Instead, Achyuta gave them procedure. In the next episode, the palace intrigues with Aliya Rama Raya that I did not have space to include here, and the advent of the man most important to our story, Hiriya Kempegowda. All that will be in the next episode, and you keep your dial tuned to me. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.